Hello and welcome to my very much delayed feedback to your Google Hangout 1. And my bad, I had to watch it twice because I had all my notes for your Hangout. I usually try to do this within a week or two of you recording them, but they have been permanently displaced. So I needed to look for some additional time where I could watch it again and get back to you on that. So since you're having another one coming, which is the assignment for the week starting tomorrow, I just decided to give you a brief overview on the first one. So the team was Judge, Andrea, Darren, and Korinne, and I wanted to tell you that I really enjoyed your coverage of topics. You did a really good job looking at all those different aspects from the readings, and you brought out and flashed out the readings. Judge was the facilitator of the session, and you all participated equally, so I really did enjoy it. So this is as far as organization, so keep it up for the second one. You didn't seem to have any serious technological issues. Few groups had experienced a little bit of a back noise, but you worked very well. So the first question that you discussed was the one of civil defense and civil protection, and I think that your group got it all pretty clear that civil defense is associated with the war effort. And the history of civil defense in the United States goes further back than 1950s. Now, you mentioned several acts from the 1950s, but already in President Wilson's administration, there was the first act, National Act on Civil Defense, that was very short-lived. It was in 1916. And so certainly within the framework of the First World War. And basically what Wilson did, he's established this committee where federal interest had to link with state interest, had to link with local jurisdictions to support propaganda for the First World War effort. And certainly that was mostly for public dissemination of war campaign messages. And in 1921, that organization sort of dissipated and does not reappear until the after the Second World War. So, but certainly very, very historically rooted, the civil defense in the war effort. So in a protection or presence of the federal system for protection at the local level. And it's mostly to protect federal interests, right? So the factories that make the tanks, the factories that make armories, making sure that the main transportation hubs remain passable if there is an attack. Make sure that people that work in a particular factory that contribute to war effort, if they get displaced, they do get logistical support in a shelter or something like that, so they can keep on producing. So it's very, very federal interest driven. But that's where the concept of civil defense, so protecting the citizens from the external enemy in a time of war, originated. Civil protection, a little bit more evolutionary from that, towards civil protection is not just for the war, right? Not just from external enemy. And involving a lot more than just military efforts as well, or federal agencies would otherwise be professionals with military background, because those were the early representatives of the federal government at the local level in the national civil defense during Wilson's times. So Darren, I think that question of dual use, Yeah, the question of dual use, I think Korinne made a comment on that, that protection factor, that it was more of a defense than protection, typically prior to 9/11, from the federal government when it has to do with security issues, so with attacks. And the post 9/11, there's this very strong focus on terrorist events. So the dual use came in to merge the approach for protection from hazards to approach for protection from threats. So your safety and security, if you're looking at the safety and security issues, security issues typically deal with intentional threat with actors, whereas hazards deal with unintentional safety issues, whether it's unintentional, human caused, or natural or technological. So typically we looked at civil protection separately in a sense of technological and non-intentional, and a civil defense for caused by war. And then the criminal justice system dealt with the criminal aspect of things, right? So it wasn't necessarily a homeland security type of concept. But the dual use thing comes to play when you build all those shelters, bankers, and public address systems and gas masks for potential biowarfare, and you've got all that arsenal where in reality you are not experiencing the nuclear attack, in a Cold War era, yet at the same time you're experiencing all those different events that are more unintentional or naturally caused, like weather events, and you're using those shelters or those public address systems. And that's the dual use, where you're actually trying to foster the capability for one, but the reality is that the frequency of the other is more, and yet they both require similar capabilities. And so in a way, and that was your later conversation, because both require similar capabilities, you're going to have that all-hazard approach coined later, post 9/11. Now, with respect to emergency management cycle, I think Darren had a really good discussion on that emergency management and its disciplines, so planning and preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation, are pretty much the anatomy of how governments, even in Western countries, in different systems, operate. With respect to security and safety, I would say that there is the mitigation, response, and recovery are very similar. I think that planning and preparedness is more characteristic of natural and unintentional issues, so it's more to do with safety, whereas prevention and protection has more to do with security issues, so those intentional things. So that one layer of emergency management cycle sort of has a little bit of a difference depending on the threat. Even though it is all hazard, we're dealing with planning and preparedness, and that's more for response versus protection and prevention, with an understanding that we cannot prevent weather phenomena, that we cannot prevent some natural occurrences, even though, as of recent and as science indicates, if we do mitigation right, we could, in fact, prevent some of those things. But and then with the aspect of intentional threats, we in a lot of cases cannot prevent them. We might only protect against them to a certain degree, so we can do target hardening. Okay, so as far as the National Guard, you had a very interesting conversation on that. So the understanding, I think, by Judge was that the National Guard has its own militia, or is its own militia. Darren was talking about National Guard under the president, even under the president, it could still be a federalized resource, but be federalized for the purposes of the state. In that sense, the National Guard is not a military outfit. So the Posse Comitatus Act, because I think this is where the gist of the issues with the National Guard is, a Posse Comitatus Act. So the act that says that the military, Department of Defense, cannot, enforce public order within the United States, right? So that's, in a nutshell, what that act says. So the National Guard is not, for all intents and purposes, considered military when it is either federalized for response to the state in emergency by the president, but still for the use of a governor, or it is actual resource of the governor for the declarations of disasters, and then the National Guard is used as a state resource. And this would all be under civil protection. So again, if the governor of the state uses National Guard for riot control, for instance, in civil disturbances, they are under Title 32. They are not considered military, no matter how they are dressed, right? And what kind of equipment they might have, which could be very heavily militarized or securitized. And that's that perception in the media of the National Guard sometimes being military because of the equipment and clothing they come in. But under the auspices of the governor, for those riots under Title 32, they are there for civil protection. So not defense from the enemy attack, but the protection for all those different ranges of threats and hazards that happen domestically. Now, and I think that when you got down to Title 10, Korinne made this really, really important distinction for us to understand the National Guard under Title 10. The Title 10 removes the command of the National Guard as a resource from the governor, and that's excellent. So under Title 10, then, Posse Comitatus comes into play. Under Title 10, then, National Guard is now used as a resource for national defense, for the external enemy, for the war effort. And the reason all that is very important to know is because the dual role of a National Guard was a huge issue in Katrina, because neither the governor, nor the mayor, nor the officials for emergency management understood the difference clearly. And so the request and the ability to use the National Guard properly, or even discuss within the framework of Katrina what the role of the National Guard was supposed to be, was very muddled, because that entire distinction between, you can say, when is National Guard military and when is National Guard not military. So they are military under Title 10, and they are used for the war effort. They are not military for all the other stuff. Basically, they are for civil protection, and they can either be federalized by the president. So, and it's all about money, how are they going to get paid, basically. Or they get paid by the governor, or they get paid by the president of the United States, so they are paying out of taxpayers' money, but still for the civil protection, not civil defense. So you flashed it out, and you did really good on that. Then you had a discussion on the federal issues of the Relief Act and what did it do in 1950, and Judge and Andrea, I think you flashed it out really well. This act is very important. I mean, there were many different reiteration of Stafford Act and all of that later on, but in 1950, that was this first time in the Disaster Relief Act when the Congress got taken out of the equation for quick decision-making for disasters to allow quicker coordination of federal money to affected jurisdictions. So that made the president ultimately capable to declare those emergency declarations, and what it means, it's financial aid to affected jurisdictions without convening a Congress, even if it's very short, to make a certain decision, the Congress still had to make it. Whereas under the 1950 Disaster Relief Act, now this entire authority to declare or dedicate financial aid from the federal government was moved to the White House. And so the requests can now be made by the or declarations by the president. So that very, very critical moment, a very important piece of legislature. Now then, you talked about different reiterations in the 50s and the 60s, and particularly the Alaskan earthquake and how the role of the federal government started to shift. So 1950s, certainly big change on both fronts when you think about it, because 1950 also had a Federal Defense Act. So again, pretty much institutionalized civil defense. The one started during President Wilson times and then sort of went off to the wayside. Well, it sort of gets reinvigorated or reestablished in 1950 by that Civil Defense Act. Concurrently, we have Disaster Relief Act. And so 1950 is a very important year for Homeland Security, if you may so choose to call it, because you have both. You have an act that decides about natural events and federal involvement more into the issues that they had not been that involved in before, to localities in a more controlled way, particularly with finances, and that strand of civil defense. So you have defense, so security, and you have safety, so the natural events and stuff like that. And all the two, both acts came out in the same year. So you can say there were germinating legislatures for future Homeland Security, except they sort of went parallel for so many years until 9/11. And so Andrea talked about need for collaboration in those increasing real large-scale events, and particularly, in Alaska, when the infrastructure is affected, when the federal interests start to be affected, like transportation hubs and things like that. So between Andrea and Judge, you discussed the quicker facilitation of federal loans, lower tax rates on 40-year loans. Darren discussed the creation of National Flood Insurance Protection Agency, federal reconstruction plans, and he also mentioned the role of the senator that was put as a point person for coordinating federal assistance to affected jurisdiction after those quakes. And that certainly would be probably a precursor, if you think about it, of the regional FEMA administrator, or even perhaps principal federal official as we know it today under the Department of Homeland Security. So that senator serving as a liaison perhaps would be a principal federal official, or maybe even the Secretary of Homeland Security responsible for domestic incident management. But now, we are still in the 50s and 60s. So how it's evolved, Korinne was talking about warning systems, the civil defense warning systems to be used for natural disaster events, and sheltering for victims, unemployment assistance, debris removal also we are seeing already in 50s and 60s those notions that are going to become big parts of emergency management, and that persists to today. Debris management is huge. Assistance with unemployment post-disaster, the sheltering needs in a short-term recovery, and so on and so forth. So you had a really good involved discussion here on all those different avalanche of changes, really all the way through the 60s. Carter administration, of course, you mentioned and you identified how the report was commissioned that discussed all different fragmentation of different resources that were doing different things in planning. And then with that, you also discussed the dual use approach, so the tools for civil defense being used for disasters and vice versa, and planning can also be applicable, and both can be integrated into the overall emergency management system. And finally, you moved on to the civil defense prep video. You were supposed to discuss the context of the Florence from last year with respect to planning and preparedness for citizens. When we make the call, or emergency management today makes the call, be prepared, make a kit, you know, how does it flesh out in reality? And you had those early videos from the civil defense times where people were told to prepare for nuclear attack. And so you had a very interesting discussion. You know, those scenes so many years later obviously seem a little bit funny to us today. But you discussed, of course, the realistic expectations of the threat. So the realistic expectations of the threat, of a nuclear threat, you know, would any of those tasks that people were supposed to do anything in the event of a nuclear fallout? And I think that's the issue number one. So realism of preparedness. And number two is people do not prepare. And so the L-shaped digging in their gardens and ditches, I think Andrea was talking about that, is, you know, how realistic is it that people are gonna, you know, rip through their yards and create those things that they are recommended to create? You know, the research on disasters generally in the last 70 years produced a very clear picture. And one consensus answer to that picture is people do not prepare. Now, some people prepare more if they have children. Some people prepare more if they have been hit by one disaster after another. Some people prepare more if they are very close to the disaster that just happened. And so within that time period, women prepare more if they have children in a household, and so on and so forth. But generally, people do not prepare. And even the latest report by FEMA on national preparedness, which just released this month, and asked general questions about preparedness being on the minds of households, 16% of households responded that it was on their minds, 57% not even on their radar, with anybody left somewhat, you know, perhaps considering it. But so 16%, so we have 1/5 of population that generally is thinking, less than 1/5 might think about preparedness, but 80% doesn't. So it's that issue as well, is, you know, you can do mass communications like that and programs like that, but the planning and preparedness, when it's being pushed over to the citizens and the responsibility of citizens, is generally a very difficult concept to do, to realize, to materialize. So, you know, going back, you know, we can critically assess the feasibility of those adjustments or preparedness actions people would take in the event of a potential nuclear war. We know more of course, from the time perspective, what the threat truly would have been. And I think that Korinne had some discussion on that. And then in certain ways, we can, instead of planning, we better off mitigating. And we are better off being in that first, what I call the first discipline of emergency management cycle, which is mitigation. We typically think about planning and preparedness as being first, and that's a fallacy, because it really starts at mitigation, right, of not creating hazardous conditions in the first place. So, and that has to do with land use and building and urban codes and development and lobbying for, different projects and things like that, which is a little bit outside of traditional zone of what the emergency manager's capabilities are. Judge made a very interesting observation. You said that, people are often even lazy to cut their own lawns. And how would you expect them to get engaged in preparedness, and especially against something like potential nuclear war? And I think that's very true. We are busy every day with prioritizing different tasks of the general living. So pushing planning and preparedness as a responsibility of a citizen also takes away from government responsibility for civil protection. And so, think about it critically in that way too. If you can say, well, those people did not leave, did not evacuate, did not have water, did not prepare for food, did not have homes strong enough or high enough, or, all that, then you can abdicate some of the responsibility of officials and official organizations that certainly should have that civil protection role. But I think that we are traditionally more used to expect from the government to protect us in a time of war, and to protect us from external enemy. And that is a given. But in security issues, particularly security is understood as the hostile enemy attack, we expect government to do all those things for us. However, when it comes historically with those natural events, President Wilson, I told you, the one that instituted the first National Defense Committee with a focus of national defense, he was absolutely reluctant to even acknowledge that the Spanish flu was an issue in the First World War when sending the soldiers to the front, because it was not a federal preoccupation that had to be dealt by the states, because it was a natural event and the federal government had nothing to do to mitigate that. And second is because it was paramount, the war effort at a time, and the federal interests in war effort were paramount to any concerns over general public health or public protection. So take it from the, from the time perspectives as well. We have that national defense is very strongly rooted in our entitlement to have that security, and yet when it comes to safety, our expectations are not as high because of how that natural unintentional aspect has been handled over the years. So when I asked you about feasibility of that mantra of make a kid be prepared for a household, Korinne had a really good observation. You said it's not really necessarily about the kid, because the kid, for the most part, in large disasters, those kids are useless. What do you need a radioactive blanket for in Florence? Or what do you need your bathtub filled up with water for in Florence? Or, what do you need batteries for radio for when most of people don't have battery operated radios nowadays and, listen to things on their cell phones? So be prepared, make a kit. How workable is it? But it creates, I think, the process of thinking, of the issues that you might be facing in a disaster. And I think that's very important. That's kind of like plans. No plan we're gonna write is ever gonna get materialized, because no disaster will be according to the plan. But by writing it, you flesh out some issues that you might want to consider, or you do that mental simulation. Where would I go, or what would I do? And it keeps people a little bit more aware. And I think in that sense, that preparedness is expectation of the community to be prepared, versus a government having a civil protection role. It's understanding that, knowing where to access information and stuff like that. You had a discussion on shelters, and I have a note on here, but obviously, as all the research shows, and as Drabek writes, and you reading Drabek this semester, Thomas Drabek, generally research shows that about 3.5% of people go to shelters. So, we're talking about sheltering, we talk about building shelters, but a very small percentage of people end up in shelters based on research anyway. But it's a sense, again, I think it's what Korinne said, is just when we talk about shelters, when we talk about evacuations, that make people start thinking, where would I go? Who is the closest family member, or, what would be the closest hotel? And so perhaps it's not what's in that kit that's going to be useful. It's just that when you put it together, it's on your mind, that you're thinking about seasonal disasters, or, high events of high probability in your area that you're vulnerable to. Okay, and then Darren talked about, I think the last part you touched up on, in that with respect to the video on civil defense, is that in addition to what I said, that 80% of the population does not prepare, there are parts of the population that are more vulnerable than others, and those populations will not have access. Like transient people, like homeless, like they won't have access to online messaging, to National Weather Service applications, to all those things that we have come up with in emergency management and developing technologies and stuff like that. The elderly might be another group that get marginalized in those cases. So wouldn't they become a responsibility, or increasing responsibility, of the federal government to look at all those different groups that generally will not be in a catchment of all this preparedness propaganda? Because even though they might be thinking about it, they're just not tuned into it with their conditions of living, with their lower socioeconomic status, or mental health, or access and cognitive needs and functional access needs. So really good discussion on that, all the things that led to the creation. Oh, one more thing, I think that was Korinne brought it up, is that disaster kit could be different in different areas based on vulnerability. And I have never really heard that point being made by one of you. And that's very interesting, because it's true that we do a lot of standardized stuff, and so it becomes a mantra, and our emergency operation plans get copied and pasted across different agencies and stuff like that, when in reality it has to be based, our planning has to be based in vulnerability and realistic risk assessments. So that is my general overview of some of your comments and some of the things that you discussed. And again, my apologies for delayed feedback, but I'm looking forward to your Google Hangout too. And I promise you I will get back to you earlier on that one. Have a good rest of the spring break, and happy St. Patrick's Day tomorrow.